Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Product Dude podcast. My name is Michael Yeomans. It is lovely to be here on a Wednesday evening. For some of the folks that are over the pond, welcome. I know it's the middle of your workday, so I thank you for tuning in. We are here today with my good friend Jamie Fernandes, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like elevating your career or even starting your career in product management and kind of his journey on where he's gone through his career. You know, as I joked around today, you saw a little bit about me talking about him being a former Red Sox pitcher. So he's had quite an interesting life. And so ultimately we're here to kind of get his insight on how he views progressing in your product career, kind of like what we talked about with Toby last week. But ultimately, you know, what does it feel like when you may be going too high too fast, right? Is the role right for you? And how do you differentiate, essentially, you know, what may be a good fit versus what may be kind of a career move? So without further ado, we're going to get into it. If you're on Twitch or YouTube, welcome. We will record. We will make sure we record and upload the videos afterwards. I made the mistake last week, so poor Toby did that whole session with me, and honestly, we have to re-record, so I apologize. It's not up on Twitch or YouTube, but we will get with that in short order. So without further ado, Jamie Fernandes, everybody. Jamie, hello. Oh, and let me get rid of that. I forgot to get rid of the participants window because that is just blatantly not cool. How are you this afternoon, sir?
I'm good, man. It's good to be with you. I haven't seen you in a while.
I know, Jamie. So jokingly enough, all jokes aside, Jamie was sitting next to me one day, and we really didn't know too much about each other. But he was the one who ultimately told me, because I was so focused on my day-to-day job when I was a technical PM. I was just so focused on like, oh, this sprint has to go this way, or these stories have to get created, whatever. That he was like, dude, you're never going to get out of the day-to-day unless you start focusing on strategy. And ultimately that kind of pushed me. I mean, I think, you know, much like people sometimes essentially realize that moment of pain where they got to make a decision, make a change. I think that was my moment of pain where I was like, oh, a light bulb went off in my head. I should probably have been thinking about this the wrong way. Yeah, I need to make a change.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because I remember that day very vividly where, you know, you were a new product manager, right? Very excited about being a product manager. And you were very focused on Jira, your tickets, how you're like in that product ownership process. And I said to you, I'm like, Mike, that's only half the job, man. Like there's so much more to product management than that. And I said, that's half the job. And you're like, and then like, you know, we had some folks leave, like you were working with Glenn, and then Shane came over, and Shane showed you that other side that I was talking about, right? And
yeah,
you know, and then you and then you started to kind of really get the full picture, right? You know, that was awesome.
to be fair, in my defense, right? I was, and I didn't even realize it, because when I first started out, that I essentially was a product owner without even realizing it. Because back then, the whole migration services part of Mimecast didn't have anybody from product managing it. So it was just me with a couple other people in engineering kind of pushing the product forward. And I could never fathom why engineering kept missing delivery dates. Like they kept missing, hey, we'll get it done by June 1st. And then, you know, June 1st would come around, or May 25th or something. They'd be like, yeah, we're not going to get it done by then. And ultimately it would continue into, you know, it just, I never understood and was missing that piece. And it was only until I shouldn't discredit Glenn, because Glenn was a great boss, and I feel like every single time I mention my failures, Glenn's like, yeah, thanks, dude. but ultimately,
it wasn't a failure, right?
Yeah,
it wasn't
100%.
A failure. It was just kind of settling into the process, and you know, things were a little bit different in the way that we approached product management back then, and right. Kind of how we worked with engineering. And we were both part of that evolution at Mimecast, you know, to kind of bring those groups closer together and kind of become more strategic in product, which, you know, we started on that journey by the time we left, we were kind of well down that road of
Yeah.
being a little more strategic and forward looking. So
Yeah. Yeah.
not a
100.
failure, an evolution.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think when we talked, Toby and I talked a little bit about that last week too, just on, it's a lesson. There's been so many lessons that I've learned through my journey, at least, that ultimately it's made me, I would never regret that experience, right? Like again, I look at it as, wow, I've gotten to the point that I'm at, in a director position because I went through it step by step and kind of gained that experience along the way, whether it was managing people or owning, that day to day, or focusing on the year 2 3 years ahead, and what that looks like, from a strategy perspective. So yeah, can you just give the lovely people out there in the ether, the internet ether, just a little bit about your story and how you kind of fell into product?
Yeah, I mean, and look, like if you came to me from the future and said, 20 plus years ago, hey, you're going to be a product manager or a leader of product managers someday, I'd be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I don't know what that is. Right. And so, like you said, my first job out of college, I played pro baseball for 3 years. Great experience. Like, it something that I always like to say, like there's no real job that you'll be in after that where you could have such an earning ceiling. But it wasn't meant to be the job that I did, and retired from. So left baseball, went into my first job was paralegal.
That's right. I
Which wasn't
forgot.
very, yeah, because my goal, like when I went to college, I wanted to go to law school. So I kind of went back to that plan as my plan B. Worked, worked in a law office for about a year, and I wasn't passionate about it. Like I showed up every day, shirt and tie, you know, created documents, running back and forth to the courthouse, like doing all those things, and I'm like, you know what, this isn't the thing I want to do. So there was a giant, like an HR outsourcer that was in the part of Florida where I was at the time. So I was living in Florida. So I went to work for them, and I was helping. Basically, the company served as like the benefits payroll kind of HR function for small businesses. So started working there, and it was a big call center type operation, and I started to get involved with technology. And at that time, like payroll transmission was done like over dial up with files. I mean, it was really
A nasty
terrible.
time.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, and we were transitioning. So I got involved with that. And then on some degrees, like they were implementing Oracle as a payroll system, which was like
Okay.
a big deal at the time. So I started to get more involved with technology, right? So then I stayed in HR, I moved back home, and again, another HR outsourcer I was working for, got involved in systems implementations and things like that. And then I had a good friend who worked for an HR, what you would call now a human capital management, like platform type company, like, a Workday or whatever, something like that.
Right.
And he said, hey, come over and work for us. Like, we're hiring domain experts to build this software. And I'm like, I'm not a software engineer. Like, I don't know about software, but I took the interview, went over, and I stayed there for 10 years. And there I got to do everything. Like I was doing development, I was doing UI development, I did UX, I did product management, I managed a consulting services group. Like I stayed there for so long because there were so many different opportunities. Like and the company grew, so fast. And so that's where I really got into technology, software, products, and that was the beginning of SaaS, which I'm dating myself, but that's when SaaS kind of was starting. So we started hosting our product, we started managing it for customers. So managed services kind of came up during that time frame, in late 90s, early 2000s kind of situation. And so I said, you know what? I like this product thing, right? I don't have to write any code. I get to talk to the business and engineers, and UX, like I sit between all the groups, and I can have my hands a little bit of everything, be as technical as I need to be, and design oriented as I need to be. And so I did, I did that, and then I got an opportunity to go sell product management software to product management groups at IBM. And I'm like, well, I'm going to take this job for a few reasons. One, it's going to be super interesting to talk to all these different product management teams in different verticals, like financial services,
Right.
aerospace and defense, insurance, consulting. It was crazy. So, and it was IBM, so it was a big, huge company, right? Which I figured out that I didn't want to ever work at a big, huge company. That's a separate story for a separate day. And you know, it was, the software itself was kind of cool. So it basically helped with prioritization. And the way it did it was like you basically rated things against each other through this interface, and then it would give you a stack ranking based on those ratings, right? So not like our we don't. There could be a separate podcast on product management prioritization models. Like, let's leave that
Yeah,
aside.
yeah,
But this was it created a relative ranking based on the value of one thing versus another, versus this kind of stacked, here are my factors, here are my scores. I mean, we all know you can kind of get the scoring to even though it looks, quantitative, it's still really qualitative at the end. Like, you know what I mean? So
yeah.
anyway, so but it was awesome. Like, I figured I really honed in on software as where I wanted to be. Like, for the manufacturing type product organizations, their cycles are so long. Like, think about, like, it's one of the companies we worked with was a defense contractor. Their cycle for building a tank was like 10 years. 10 years from requirement, like first requirements to release, is like 10 years. Like, great, like, just very, very long cycles, right? Um, so that's how I really got a good view of, kind of honed in on where I wanted to be in product. And then I went back into like this hybrid product SE role for a little bit at an HR software company, and then back into product management completely, where I've been ever since. So that's kind of my journey at a high level.
Yeah, when it comes to, and for those who, because I think this is a really good point, because I quite clearly, right, going from my previous role at Mimecast, from a SaaS platform to a hybrid product. So we would love to eventually have a SaaS option, but right now it's a hybrid product. Can you talk about kind of the differences when it comes to product management for those? Because obviously SaaS, being, you're hosting it, is very different from a hybrid product. So some people may be thinking about, well, oh, we're trying to do that because somebody used to reach out to me recently, about pricing, because they're trying to outsource development, which we do as well, in some aspects.
Yeah.
And so they were like, we're trying to build, a SaaS platform. So can you just talk about some of those differences when it comes to product management? And while there's a lot of similarities, it is very different, at least from my aspect, sometimes on how you have to work through that.
So yeah, so let's qualify that a little bit. So when you say hybrid product, do you mean like services and software, or do you mean
100%. Like, so yeah,
on-prem
so again, it could
SaaS,
be it
or
could be a hybrid product where it's cloud agnostic and on-prem, that has, a variety of services that could get tied to it.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think fundamentally, this is my view, right? So fundamentally, the core approach is the same. The things you have to worry about are a little different in terms of like cost to serve, in terms of the features and functions for like a hybrid product versus SaaS, right? Like, and where I am today, we have both. We have on-prem and SaaS. right? So clearly there's things that you could do in a single tenant on-prem product that you can't do in a multi-tenant SaaS environment, right? Like you can't have access directly to the database to run queries in a multi-tenant SaaS environment. Where if you're on-prem, all you need to do is be able to instantiate that database connection securely, and you can do whatever you need to do, right?
Right.
So there's those types of differences that you have to consider. You know, your cost base in SaaS is completely different in how you calculate your cost to serve and all of that versus what you're doing on-prem, right? It's more about delivering the software. The customer absorbs the cost of hosting, and unless you're doing like a hybrid cloud where you say, you know, well, we'll give you the AWS infrastructure, but you got to manage it. So you'll pay us to host it, but you'll manage it, right? That's a model, right? Otherwise, the customer can just take your product and put it in their AWS and manage it, right? Or they could host it on Bear 10, if they're running their own cloud and blades and all that and data center infrastructure, right? So I'd say fundamentally, like what you're trying to achieve from a product evolution perspective and your
Right.
approach to product managing that is the same. It's really about the cost and the model the financial model on both sides of the equation, SaaS versus hybrid or on-prem.
100%. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's just good to kind of discuss it because ultimately that's been my journey, is kind of going back
Yeah.
from SaaS into hybrid products. And ultimately I was kind of, at first like, oh, what?
Yeah.
Oh no, it's like, oh, I got to think about all these different costs I didn't know before. This is manic. But no, it's good to kind of break it down because again, fundamentally it's the same. And I think one of the times where I realized how, even from a physical perspective, I met a woman who was building small gyms in India, and so ultimately the way she approached it was the same. And I actually met her through, I think it was pragmatic marketing. So I was taking the 3 of the pragmatic marketing courses, which are great for those starting out. But like ultimately, yeah, like, she was talking to me through the process and I was just kind of, and that was still at the start of my journey, right? Like that was still at the start of, oh, I don't really know what product management is. I know that I'm a product owner, but, I don't know enough of the business side or even UX, right? So, ultimately it was just focusing on technology.
Yeah, and I think look, like your natural inclination when you're coming from SaaS to hybrid or on-prem is to try to make everything SaaS. I think what you need to do is step back and really understand the business itself.
Yep.
Like okay, I have a cohort of customers that are on-prem. What's that revenue? Is it healthy revenue? Like, am I supporting those customers the way they need to be supported? Or, are all my eggs in the SaaS basket? Those customers are suffering, and I need to either figure out a path for them to migrate to the new version,
Right.
or I'm going to split my investment between SaaS and on-prem, keep them happy, right? And, you know, and it's okay. The reason why most companies that have hybrids tend to be less valuable than pure SaaS, right? So, you might get a multiplier that might be less than 10x if you're hybrid or on-prem versus if you're full SaaS. Like we're past that kind of, we're on a down curve of valuations, right? Like
Yeah.
they were last year, probably like at the end of Q1. I mean, we're talking about like for a really solid SaaS revenue base and architecture technology, it could be anywhere from like 11 to 16x revenue, right? So, that you can run and sustain a business with both, but the valuation of this full SaaS business is higher, which is why people try to take their on-prem and migrate it to SaaS, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's something that is a driver. But it should come down to two things. What's the best thing for the customer? What's the best thing for your company after that, right? Those two things sometimes don't always align, but what's the best thing for the customer, right? If they're running the software and your overhead to maintain both is not, crushing your business, maybe the best thing for both of you is to preserve what you're doing on-prem and create a path to the future for the customer over time,
Right.
right? Because I think that the alternative is they feel forced to move, they don't want to move, and anytime you create a case for change, that means that competitors can come in and look at, and the customer can go look at a competitor and they say, well, if I have to change, then I'm gonna go to this system instead of yours, right? So
Yeah.
it's a delicate balance, man.
Yeah, that's great. No, no, yeah, 100%. So a lot of the business side of stuff. So ultimately, we were actually chatting about this last week as well. And you know me, I am not really big, and I hate unicorn hires. Like, I hate people. I shouldn't say hate. Strongly dislike a lot of the descriptions out there that are talking about, ultimately, I'm looking for, a bunch of tick boxes. Ultimately, somebody who knows fintech or ad tech or has an MBA or has a 3.9 GPA or whatever. And so ultimately, there are also product leaders out there that feel, whether, well, again, say, hey, I don't hire product managers. I hire, people with their MBA, and then I teach them the other side of things. Like, how do you, for me, like, I got an associate's degree, right? Like, I didn't even finish my bachelor's. Ultimately, I think I've been, I would say, pretty successful in my product management career over time. So ultimately, for the folks that are just trying to get into it, you having kind of a similar path to me, where it's just, hey, I did this and I did that, and I didn't really want to do it, but then I got involved with this thing, and now I love this thing. For folks that are even trying to go for their first associate role, how do you think they get into it? Maybe not having, that educational side of the house.
Yeah, I think look, like, product management is one of those roles where there is no school, right? Like, you can't go to, BU or, university and say, I want to be a product manager, put me in that course of study. They're going to say, oh, computer science, or, like,
Yeah.
there's no coursework. So,
Right.
like, there's no degree to look for to say, oh, that person's a perfect fit for product management. Like, if you look at if you put 10 product managers in a room and looked at their CVs and their educational credentials, like, it probably cut a few different ways. You'd have some folks who don't have degrees, right? Or might have like an associate degree. There's some folks who might not have a degree. They've worked for a long time in tech, like maybe support or some other area, right? You will have the MBAs, like, power to you for that extra school. Like, hopefully those loans aren't crushing you and you get to the right spot, right? But it's all over the board as far as like what I've seen in my experience. What I look for are product management athletes, like people who have the experience first as a product manager, right? I'm less influenced by education and more influenced by experience, right? Like, now there's going to be bars to entry in certain companies based on credentials, like bigger ones probably, right? Like the Amazons and the Metas and stuff like that, where it's more competitive for the
Sure.
roles, right? But I think for me, it's about product management athleticism, and then if they have domain knowledge, that's also great, right? But you've seen, I mean, you and I have both seen people move from finance into product, support into product, customer service, managed services into product, which is what you were doing. Like, so
Data
there's
science,
all these different.
yeah, data scientist seems to be another big one where last year when I was at a proc conference, I talked to not only a founder of a company, right, who had that same career track where he went from a data scientist into a product role and then now founding his own
Yeah.
company, but also people that were there that were like, I am a data scientist. I'm just getting started in product. I'm I'm having trouble, getting out of that
Yeah.
mindset of a data scientist. And, it's interesting.
Well, it's hard, right? Because
Yeah.
like I had a product manager once, you may be familiar, where they were an engineer, and so they would actually submit tickets with code in it, like write this code. And I'm like, you can't do that anymore. Like, you're not an engineer. Like, even, you need to focus on, you need to be end result oriented. Like, what are you expecting to happen for the customer? Not write this code, right? Like, no engineer is going to cut and paste code from a product manager into their environment and then ship it. Like, at least I hope not, right? So, um, it's a shift, when you mentioned the data scientist, right? Like, I was looking for an analytics product leader recently, and I saw some really smart people who had really deep backgrounds in analytics and data science with a little bit of product, like, and it was more taking the things that they were driving and building to market, with a product focus. So, very much like hybrid type roles where, you can have the data scientist paired with a good product manager and get similar
Sure.
results, but it's, definitely interesting. So, yeah, I mean, this is like one discipline within companies where, like, again, no school, the more experience you have and the more things you see, the better, I think, the better you look to a hiring manager, on paper. And that experience could be technical, it could be in support, because you take what we do, Mike, and you line it up against the skills that you derive over the time, right, in roles, right? If you spend a lot of time and you've risen through support, from L1 to L2 to L3 to escalations, like, you have a certain set of skills that you've acquired around managing
Sure.
customers and being customer facing. You and I both know that's a huge part of our jobs, right? We talk to customers all the time, and you need to be able to ask them the right questions to get to elaborate requirements and, kind of elicit problem statements and all of those things. And so you just line up those skills against product management, and it's just interesting because, like, I've seen many people from many different parts of businesses come into product and be wildly successful, right? And it's tough to really pin a persona and say, yep, that's my ideal product manager, because I don't know that there is one, right? I think it's one of those roles where it's just super interesting to, get people. And I think the best teams, and what I've tried to do in my career when I'm building teams, is to have different perspectives. Have some folks that are internal subject matter experts, have some folks that are strong product managers with deep product management background, put them together and let them feed off of each other and work as a unit, right? And that you get that cross pollination of external experience, internal subject matter expertise, and it kind of makes a stronger team, right?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. No, I couldn't agree more. Ultimately, for me, I found that the best people, especially with people that are trying to start their career, just having empathy for the user, right, and curious about solving a problem. Ultimately, when you start with, I just want to make people's lives easier because that's what your products are supposed to do. products are essentially part of some of these daily tasks, whether that's one person or multiple people. So all the way down from end user, you could have millions, right, that may be using an application, all the way to maybe one person that's using a product that, just solves one day-to-day task. Like, again, having that backup and recovery product previously, that was kind of like set it up, make sure it's going, and then if there's a problem, you go back to it. Or if there's something that happens, you go back to it, right? It's not like you spend all your time in it. So the product retention seems quite low, but ultimately people are happy it's doing its job. So, have people just being like, hey, this works for me. I have one task today. This helps solve that problem. Your job's done. And so another part to that is understanding how you're going to make an impact. So I'm reading a book, that a nice gentleman wrote around product direction. And I'm going to hold my hand up and say I'm reading it because he's going to be at the same conference I'm at next week. And I want to be able to discuss it a bit with him. so I'm like reading it. I'm like, yeah, this all makes sense. But, ultimately it's product direction by this one. I don't know if you've read this one, but it's product direction by Nacho Bacino. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Okay. He can be crap next week. But ultimately, yeah, again, how is your product making an impact, right? If I had a product that essentially had 200 some odd connectors, that touches a lot of different use cases, that touches a lot of different customers that have, different connectors or different data sets, whatever I can connect to. But is that really making an impact? Is the product itself doing the job where it's bringing in more customers, that I'm trying to, reach that target audience? Or am I just trying to reach more geos? Am I trying to do this? Again, you could build a great product and you could have all these features, but ultimately, if sales is scratching their head and they're saying, I really don't know how to sell this, are you doing your job?
Yeah, and so there's two things that I would add to that, what you just said, right? I think, and I had this saying, I've been coaching for a very long time after baseball, right? And I always say this to the kids who play for me: winning is an outcome of doing the right things, right? It's an outcome. It's not what you focus on. If you prepare, if you practice until you don't get it wrong, if you do the right things, you will win, right? So let's translate that into what we do. If you focus on what is the right thing for the customer, what outcomes am I creating for the customer? Positive outcomes, right? If you focus on those two things, you will win. You will have a product that solves a problem that can be sold clearly on its value, and your business will scale. You can build 1,000 features and never have a positive business impact for either your customer or your company.
100%.
Right? So, and like, you could call it, there's many ways to say it, right? Outcomes over outputs, however you want to say it. If you're not creating value for a customer, you're not going to drive the right result for your business. Like, you don't sell anything. So the only way you create value for the company is to understand customer problems, solve them, and then make sure that sales understands the value of that solution for the customer so that they can get the money, the revenue for the company, right? So I think, it's all about outcomes for the customer and for the company, and we sit right in the middle of that, right? And that's a huge responsibility, first of all, right? And that's when you talk about scope of impact. Like, product can have the biggest positive or negative impact on the business.
100%.
And I've seen it both ways, right? So
yeah, and it's great. I think it's great to have that experience, because I've definitely been a part of that. And it's not, again, you think, again, it's not a failure. You can't consider it a failure. You make some mistakes along the way, and ultimately you learn from that, right? How you take it into your next endeavor is really what matters, and kind of figuring out, okay, I messed up here. Whether, again, because I always used to love, I forget where it came from, but ultimately your opinion, while interesting, is irrelevant. So ultimately, you're not, I never really liked, and I know a lot of people kind of think this, but I never really liked you're the mini CEO of your product, because that's, to me, is just not true.
So it's funny that you say that because I know exactly where that came from. It came from Steve Johnson. He was he was a principal in pragmatic marketing when I took
Oh
pragmatic
yeah,
marketing.
that's exactly where it came from. Yeah, yeah.
And he taught, and so he taught my class specifically. Like I went through the 3 day. Back then, it was like a 3 day. It was 2 days of the basically before they broke it out into all the pieces. You had 2 full days, which covered like foundations and all those
Right.
elements, and then and launch, like all the way through to launch. And then you had one day which was focused on strictly requirements. So Steve taught that class. So about 2 months ago, I got a LinkedIn from Steve, a LinkedIn invitation from Steve. So I responded to him and I go, I feel like I've arrived in my product management career if you are connecting with me on LinkedIn. And I said, you said something that I carried with me for 20 years as a product manager. Your opinion, well, interesting, is irrelevant. And you said, and he responded to me, he goes, he thought it was hilarious. And he goes, I've changed it over the years to say our opinion,
Our opinion, yeah, be
well,
inclusive.
interesting is irrelevant because, yeah, exactly. Well, he's like, because a lot of product managers were doing things in isolation, and it's really about like a
Yeah.
broader view. So he's like, that's why I changed it to our. But I thought that was really funny that you just said
Yeah,
that.
no, and I mean, it, like, light bulb moment. I now I remember it because I'm pretty sure it's the same guy, and it's kind of funny. It's like I'm
Yeah.
on year 7, and that's still sticking with me. And anybody I ever bring on from a product data science development perspective, I always bring that with me because I just think it's important. Again, we may we I can't even tell you how many times. Well, I can tell you because I'm about to tell you how many times
Yeah.
you ultimately start to work through what they did, especially if you're coming into something that's already been built or almost built. And so you come in and you say, hey, walk me through this. How many decisions are made just based off of going through the motions of, right, like if it's a connector, going through the motions of creating that connector and just all the options that you get right through the API or what have you, and ultimately saying, oh, well, we need to cover this option and that option, right? And essentially then you end up, again, outcomes over outputs, right? Where essentially there's all this output of like, oh, we got to make sure we cover this and that and the other thing. And then you end up not getting the thing out until like a year later, and you've pretty much missed the boat for the most part. But just how people would think, people think in that mindset of, well, we just need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. And so then when you get the connector, right, it covers all these different edge cases, but half those edge cases probably aren't, what people want or what they would consider when they're actually configuring the thing, right? So it's just, again, it's, without, proper direction, people go down that wild path of, just like, oh, we got to provide this, we got to do that, we got to provide this. And that's been my experience, over the last few years is that, is just that.
Yeah, and I think that's an MVP problem, right? That's
Yeah,
just making sure you're honed in on what is the highest value, minimum viable product that you can release first, and then iterating from there, right? Like I
sure.
think that's kind of, and a lot of I don't want to say there's a lot of ocean boiling, but you do need to get something in market, get feedback, and learn, right? Like I want to go back to something you said about failure, right? So failure is your greatest teacher, and
Yoda
you
said so.
shouldn't, yeah, it's your greatest teacher. Like, and like that is the one thing that I think I've carried. Like, baseball is a game rooted in failure. Like, there's no other job you could have, Mike, where if you were only right 3 out of 10 times, you'd be considered good, right? Like hitting a baseball, if you get it 3 out of 10 times, you're considered good at it, right? So you failed 70% of the time, right? So it's about taking what you learn from that failure and how you adapt or evolve based on it, right? So like I have this conversation with my team all the time. Like I'm like, don't stick that bread knife in the toaster because you're gonna get shocked. Like, well, what do you mean? I go, because I've already made that mistake in my career. Let me tell you what's gonna happen. Don't do it. And here's what you need to
Right.
do. Right. So you take those lessons and you know evolve. Like I you know I have a friend who's a coach, and you know I work with him, you know, at camps and things, you know, occasionally, and he has a great saying, and he puts it on his t-shirts, and I love it because it's so true. You either win or you learn, right? You don't lose. You only lose when you quit, right? So you win or you learn, right? So you know if you're always successful, guess what? You're not learning anything. You know, I mean, it sounds cliche, but it's actually very true, right? Like if you have no adversity in your career, if you don't face any challenge, you won't grow,
Right.
right? In not do that thing again, or stop that from happening again with your team as you become a manager, or you know as you become an executive, you know, helping the company course correct, right? So you have to fail or you have to learn. Like
Yeah.
you that's it. Like you're either winning or you're learning, right? and and,
Speaking.
and they could be, go ahead.
Oh, no, no, no. Go. No, go for it.
No, I was going to say it can be as simple as, you know, I say this to my team all the time, like it's software. There's no scenario where you would be that catastrophically wrong where we couldn't fix it in a release, right? Another release. But it could just be that you missed a use case in a feature that you just need to come in and add, right, in the next release. And you've gotten feedback from the market. Like I don't really see that as a failure. I see that as we learned, we fill the gap, we move on to the
Right.
next thing, right? So
Yeah. 100%. No, in speaking with that, I wanted to get to kind of the next piece of this was, again, you in your career, because you to me have, I mean, a lot of people struggle with this. A lot of people struggle with this, right? Ultimately, I move into a leadership role. Maybe it's a manager role. Maybe it's an individual. It could still be an individual contributor role. But again, they take that next step and sometimes take that next step too quickly. We've seen it, right? People that are just stepping in from one role into a senior PM role, or or another role where essentially they've had no product experience and they're just again having to bear the weight of what kind of that industry standard is, right? What that role and responsibility, what those responsibilities mean. That again, if you are, let's say, just stepping into a senior PM role or a director role and not having had any previous experience, right, and what the industry would expect of that role and responsibilities, then coming to a conclusion where, you know what, I am not, this is not a good fit for me. Ultimately, I am sinking because I do not have that experience. When is it a good time to take a step back and say, maybe I need to take a step back in my career, or I need to, find something else because ultimately, I'm climbing too high too fast and it could burn you.
yeah, I mean, what if, you know, I'm gonna use, I wish I could put up like the Morpheus meme. What if I told you your career path doesn't have to be linear, right? Like it doesn't have to be linear. I mean, there are some people who have very linear career paths, right? Like they were a product manager, then they were a senior, then they were a
Right.
director, then they were a senior director, then they were a VP, then they were an SVP, then they were a CPO, right? But I think it comes down to a few things. So it comes down to, look, everybody's been a first time something somewhere in your progression,
Yeah.
right? You're going to go from senior to director, you're going to be a first time director. You're going to go from director to senior director, you're going to be a first time senior director, right? You're going to be a first time VP, at some point, right?
Sure.
So if that's the track you want to stay on. So, you're going to be a first time something somewhere, right? The ideal is that you have prepared and your opportunity meets your preparation,
Right.
right? Seneca called that luck, right? Preparation meets opportunity, that's luck, right? So you but it doesn't have to be linear. You could step into a role and like I think it's a matrix thing, right? Like it's the opportunity for what that role is for you in your career progression, right? So just let's just call it, let's say VP, right?
Yeah.
Versus what the company's needs are and where it is in its stage, right? So if you're going from director, like there's nothing to say you can't make the jump from director to VP in a smaller company,
Sure.
right? Like and I'm not saying you specifically, I'm saying any product manager, right? Like it depends on what the needs of that company is and where they are in their stage and scale and what their aspiration is intersected with your skills and what you can bring, right? There's been plenty of folks that are, directors that are really smart and can help scale a small
Right.
company to a certain point, right? If you don't have experience, like there's folks that have built their careers just on being smaller company scalers and scaling to some kind of exit and then moving on to the next thing, right? So it's your skills, the opportunity, and kind of do those two things fit and intersect, right? Now, sometimes they might appear that way, but then
Right.
things change. And so, there could be a company could get bought, like the leadership could change. There's a whole bunch of different things that can happen. Expectations can change, and you may not be able to rise to meet those. So you can lateral, you could take a step back, you can, you know, and there, I don't think there's any harm and shame in doing that, right? Like
Sure.
in my personal career, so I was a senior product manager. I made a jump to director. At the same company, there was a big upheaval, a lot of leadership change, and I was promoted to VP, right? So on paper, I was a VP. I was in the executive team, and I literally just jumped from senior product manager. So thrown way into the deep end of the pool in a small company, like we're talking 50, 60 million in revenue, right? Their needs were were you know were were a fit, right? Like the culture changes over time led me to
Right.
leave, but that's a different conversation. But like they didn't have sophisticated executive product management leadership needs. So it worked, right, for a period of time. And then, I got tapped on the shoulder for a new opportunity in a bigger company, but it was a principal product management role. And the difference, like, so I set the title aside. I said, what's the opportunity? And it was to start a new line of business inside of a $400 million revenue
Right.
cybersecurity company, which is a way bigger opportunity than what I was doing, leading product for a $50 million, you know, uh, you know, physician social networking, pharmaceutical marketing company,
Sure.
right? So I had no qualms about stepping, back in title, the comp was better, right? So back in title for better comp, for more stability and a bigger opportunity. And you shouldn't, like, I think you just have it's very individual, right? Some people chase money. I always say don't chase the money. Like just don't chase the money. It's the biggest kind of it's the biggest trap out there, right? Because you can get yourself into quite a bad situation career-wise, but then you're literally forced to step backwards,
Right.
right? Because things don't line up, and suddenly you're gonna have to step backwards in title and in comp, which is gonna leave a mark, right?
Yep.
As well. So I think it's on its face, it's not simple. Like you don't have to have a linear career path. I think it's very much about the opportunity. And what I would say is like, to all the product managers and folks who are thinking about it, really hone in on, and I think this was important for me, I think, kind of after I went through that, hone in on what you want, and what your skills will make you successful at doing, right? And understand where that edge is, right?
Sure.
Where you're gonna have to stretch or go. If there's a gap, like, you're gonna have to fill that gap, right? Like, I mean, I've been super fortunate in my career to have a lot of mentors, right? Like, my my bosses at Sophos were great product people, right? One was ex Intuit, another one was ex Symantec, great product management focused people. And my the GM of the business unit took me aside one day. He's a CEO at a company now, and he said, "You're going to be really good at this job someday." And I said, "What do you mean I'm not good at it now?"
Yeah, I'm not
Like,
good
I
at
thought
it
I was
now.
good at
What
it.
do you mean?
And he said, "You're good at building products, but you need to look at the whole picture." Like, this is the conversation you and I had. I was a great, like, hands-on builder of stuff. My, Jira stories, working with engineering, like, very comfortable there. He's like, "Okay, how many deals did you do last quarter?" I'm like, "I don't know. That's sales' problem." He's like, "No,
Nope.
it's not.
No,
It's
it's
your
not.
problem."
No, that's your problem. Believe you me, it is.
How many support tickets per thousand? Like, what's the quality of your product? I'm like, I don't know. QA is testing it. They cover that stuff. That's your problem too. And, like, he helped me see the big picture of, like, the product is the business, right? So sales has to be enabled, support has to be enabled, the product needs to be supportable. If you don't do those things, there's cost that comes back against what you're generating in revenue, right? And so, like, think about it from a holistic P&L perspective and all the things that the product is doing across the business, right? And that was like, like a really eye-opening
Yeah, mind blown moment.
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, it was like it was the light bulb moment for me that I took from that point forward, and then when I came to Mimecast, and now kind of where I am today. So, I think it's about, don't be afraid to go non-linear, right? Line up with what the opportunity is, what the company's needs are, what your skills and what you bring. And I would say, be realistic about that. Look, there's no harm in saying, like, you know what, I don't know this. I'm not as versed in the finance side of product as I would like to be. I got to learn that. I got to find or seek out, somebody who can help me with that, right? And build those skills that will then get you to the next thing, versus trying to reach too far, for a bridge too far, because, you're not gonna you're going to do yourself a disservice. You're going to do the company a disservice. Like, I think, and ultimately it's going to show, right? Like, everybody fancies themselves a product leader until they have to lead product. It's like that everybody thinks they're a gangster until they have to do gangster stuff. Right? Like, it's you really, there will be a point where you really got to execute it, and if you can't, then that becomes glaringly obvious.
Yeah,
So,
100%.
yeah, so I think it's not simple, but you can go non-linear. People do every day, and their careers take a little meandering journey left or right for a little while, and then they eventually get back on the track they want to get to, right?
Yeah.
So,
And folks, for those who are listening and watching, ultimately, there is no such thing really as a 10-year roadmap, apparently, outside of building tanks. So you really don't have to you don't have to worry about thinking 10 years into the future when it comes down to your product. But you do, what was interesting to me about Mimecast specifically was that it was kind of off of sucker's bet. At a time they said, hey, we're going to double down on this archiving thing and having a SaaS platform, and we're going to offer, you know, again, very minute, very minute offering of capabilities, right? That were more geared towards data governance and managing data, right? And then go after kind of the security thing and kind of building up that business over the years. Now, did they do everything right? No, absolutely not. And I could stand by that today, but they did a lot of things right, in a sense of building that up, and they had such crazy uncomfortable growth, right? We were both there for a period of time, but I think to all the folks that are out there now kind of scaling up, you do kind of have to look at and pay attention to those industry trends and kind of where it's going in the next 5, 10 years potentially, because you do want to make a good bet today, ultimately, especially, because all these folks now are thinking low code, no code versus high code, which has been traditional for years. But I think what I've learned, especially being high code on a product, is essentially then there's a splash effect, right? And so ultimately, especially if you're going down the microservices route, there's a lot of things you have to take into account, and it doesn't make sense for a small team, to have that big splash effect, because ultimately, and from experience, ultimately building out product that essentially, if you have that big splash effect, your timelines are always probably going to be quite interesting, I think, because ultimately you're going to have one or multiple folks essentially are going to have to be able to take all those into account. And I just think these days, because people are using Click to like white label the back end and things like that. So, what are your kind of thoughts on that whole piece? Because that is, I think, also interesting from a product manager perspective, where they have to consider, some of that, especially if it's coming from the top down, to say, hey, we need to look at these other options, and they may not have experience in that. Obviously the tech side, because I've always loved Petra Willow, who wrote Strong Product People. I always loved her diagram of UX technology and business, where you kind of have to operate in that middle, where you're not an expert in either, but you need to be able to understand, right, the tech stack, the business side of the house, and ultimately that user journey, like that, design-led approach of walking through the customer's shoes and arriving at, what you want your outcomes to be. So yeah, what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, let's double click on your last
Yeah,
two
two
thoughts.
things.
So
Yeah.
so on if we're talking about our former employer specifically, right? Like your single greatest tool is understanding of the market, right? So and the dynamics within it, because that's going to help you have that vision, right? Like markets emerge, they develop and mature, they consolidate, and they commoditize and they consolidate, right? Like markets have a life cycle, right? Email, like first it was the Viagra email, then it was advanced threats, right? So everybody started blocking spam. Everybody got good at it. The tactics started to change, and advanced threats and emails started to show up. People started putting in antivirus and other things to detect the threats in email. Then impersonation, right? So there's that evolution within email. But then all of the vendors realized, hey, like I see this traffic, I'm getting this traffic anyway.
Right.
I'm getting their emails anyway. Why don't I just start storing them for them, like archiving, right? So, and because that's going to let me sell, and you and I both know, like that was initially the same buyer, then it evolved into a different buyer.
Sure.
Right. So then you had two basically two different economic buyers in the same company. I'm expanding my average, order value, like with having a package that can serve those two buyers, right? So that's just, we saw, okay, I can leverage my core technology and do this other thing. Same thing with web security, like secure web gateways, DLP,
Right.
all that good stuff, like using the proxy to inspect files and all of those things. Like you're just, again, expanding, understanding my market dynamics. Where am I? Can I enter into an adjacency, and expand the business, right? It's logical stuff. Like the second part of your thought, right? It's always a build, buy, or partner like lens you got to look at it through. Analytics, there's a lot of companies that have solved that in an abstract and generic way that you can leverage as a white label, or partnership, right? Like Sisense, Click, like there's a bunch of them, right? That stuff is hard to build, right? Like a lot of, analytics platforms, like I would focus on the proprietary things that I need to do to move the data, the back end, like the schema and all of those things, like the data visualization stuff. Like if I just need to connect it to the back end through APIs and database views, or however you wanted to get that data to the front end, like you can pretty much, OEM that into your product, and then you just need to account for it in the cost basis, right? So it's really a question of time to market and ability to invest, right? Like you don't have to build everything. Like that's a
Right.
big trap that a lot of companies fall. Oh, it must be made here, otherwise it's no good. Like we've lived it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah.
So and that's it, a lot of in that mindset, like what's behind those words is the fear of the unknown. Like, well, I didn't build it, so I don't know how to integrate it. That feels hard and I'm nervous about it, right? So then I'm just going to default to it wasn't built here, it's not good. Like we have to build it, right? And you just have to understand that, and help get folks to the same place you are with, we shouldn't build this, here's why. I know it's going to be hard on the integration side, and it might take more time, but I'm willing to invest that because I think the opportunity cost to build it will be higher than the actual hard cost of renting this and integrating it.
I'll never
You know
forget
what I
this.
mean?
This is complete. I mean, this pretty much arrives at the point, but I know somebody, a good friend of mine, right? Won't swim in the ocean because he's seen movies like Jaws and Lake Placid and all these other monster films. So ultimately, hey, just because you watch Jaws doesn't mean you shouldn't swim in the ocean, because the chances of getting bitten by a shark are pretty much like getting shocked by lightning. So yeah, ultimately you shouldn't, it shouldn't be a fear-based decision, right? To not go with something like that, because again, I think we learned our lesson on the connectors piece is ultimately for me today, right? When it comes down to connectors to my platform, I would outsource those. They're simple enough, that they can go another route rather than my team wasting the time. I shouldn't say wasting the time, but spending the time on doing that when there are a lot of other things from a strategy piece that they need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Right. Jamie Fernandes, we are approaching the hour, and I know that you have to get on with your day, and I need dinner. So ultimately, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for joining us this week. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I hope that the good folks at home have gotten a lot out of this. It will be obviously recorded up to YouTube and Twitch, so they can watch it at any time. But again, your expertise is always welcomed, and we would love to have you back in the future.
You're the man. Great to catch up with you, man. I miss you.
I miss you. I know, absolutely. It was a great.
I'll talk to you anytime.
Sounds good to me. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again for joining the Proc, dude.
All right, you too, man. Have a good one.
All right, see ya. All right. So what did we learn today? We learned a little bit about Proc leadership, right? About Jamie's journey and ultimately where he. But again, a lot of people don't want to talk about the setbacks, and so ultimately, I think that was extremely important for him to kind of cover. Is essentially sometimes the setbacks. Ultimately, man, is this a good career move for me? And where there are other opportunities that maybe best fit kind of where I'm at in my career, right? Talked a little bit about the difference between products and product areas, especially from a hybrid product versus SaaS product. Some of us have been on SaaS our entire lives. Some of us have moved between SaaS and hybrid products and on-prem and whatever the case may be. And so ultimately, I think those are good points to kind of touch on. So ultimately, hey, man, I'm just starting this podcast out. So I'm sure there is more to come and more for us to cover. So ultimately, I can't thank everybody enough for joining today. We actually are, yes, we are going to at least talk about one sponsor today. Well, they're not actually sponsoring. I'm just actually promoting it. But again, Product Camp EU is happening next week. So ultimately, if you go to, I think it's Cyprus, cyprus.productcamp.eu, you can sign up. They're doing an online trek, so I think it's free if you want to view it online. But if you want to join me in Cyprus, you are more than welcome to do so. I think it's going to be a great time. It's one of the oldest prog conferences, one of the longest running prog conferences out there. And so ultimately, it's going to be a good experience because there's a lot of great talent out there, like Sean Flaherty and Nacho, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote Product Direction. And I will be speaking on the art of personal branding, which everybody knows or doesn't know that it is near and dear to my heart. And ultimately, we are going to be actually writing some more material on that. And you can look at my past posts from a personal brand perspective on theproductdude.uk. Check out the blog series. We will be uploading the additional podcasts that we recorded offline, so hopefully those will be coming soon. But I can't thank everybody enough for joining the Product Dude. I am Michael Yeomans, your host, and we will be signing off today. Stick to those user requirements, and happy hunting, product managers. We'll see you soon. Hey folks, if you liked that video, consider subscribing, and together we can make the world a better place, one product at a time.